What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
5 birthdays straight, and not a single call, card, or half-hearted text from my parents, not even one of those lazy happy birthday posts people throw on Facebook just so the world knows they remembered. For me, there was nothing, only silence. Like I didn't exist in their world anymore. Like the day I was born had stopped mattering the second they found a more convenient child to celebrate. I used to tell myself they were busy, that work or money or stress had pulled their attention elsewhere, and for a while those excuses softened the sting. But as the years stacked up, as the candles on my cakes went unlit and the evenings passed without so much as a voicemail, the weight of being invisible pressed down harder and harder until denial turned into something colder, something bitter. The first year, I waited by my phone, convinced mom would call by dinner, certain dad would at least shoot over one of his awkward two-line texts. When midnight came and went, I told myself maybe they just mixed up the days, that tomorrow they'd catch themselves and apologize. The second year, when the day passed again in silence, I bought my own cake from a grocery store and laughed out loud as I lit the candles, the kind of laugh that doesn't come from joy but from disbelief, a sound I could feel in my chest more like a cough than a giggle. The third year, I didn't even wait. I went to work, answered emails, went home, poured myself a glass of wine and tried not to care, but the truth is, it stung more because by then I had realized this wasn't forgetfulness, this was a pattern. By the fourth year, I stopped expecting anything at all, but the absence still gnawed at me, especially when I saw the way they went out of their way for my sister. By the fifth year, the bitterness had settled so deep it felt almost natural, like breathing. Because here's the thing, while my phone sat silent on my birthday, my sister's life was a parade of spotlights and confetti thrown by the very same people who couldn't bother to pick up the phone for me. She landed a new job. They threw a dinner. She sneezed. There were flowers on her doorstep. She once posted a blurry picture of a burnt casserole, and mom reshared it with a caption about how her girl can do no wrong in the kitchen. I wanted to scream, not because she didn't deserve attention, but because the imbalance was so blatant, so insulting. It was like watching your parents play favorites in front of the whole world and daring you to say something. I scrolled through Instagram on the night of my 31st birthday, curled on the couch, wine glass balanced on my chest, and that's when the gut punch landed. My sister was smiling, standing in front of a brand new car, the kind with showroom shine and plastic still clinging to the seats, wrapped in a giant red bow like something out of a commercial. The caption read, "Thank you, Mom and Dad. Best surprise ever." Her smile was wide, the kind of grin that dares you to feel jealous, and the comments poured in, friends cheering her on, coworkers congratulating her, strangers gushing over the best parents ever. I stared at that photo so long my phone screen dimmed and went black, but the image was burned into me. That bow, that caption, that proof that for 5 years I wasn't forgotten, I was deliberately excluded. The worst part wasn't the car. It wasn't the bow or the Instagram post or the fake perfection of it all. The worst part was the realization that they had been making a choice, year after year, to ignore me, to funnel their attention, their love, their money, into someone else while leaving me with nothing but silence. There's something cruel about knowing your absence isn't an accident but a preference, that you weren't overlooked, you were dismissed. And sitting there, phone in hand, staring at the glow of that photo, I felt something shift inside me. I used to make excuses, tell myself they'd come around, that one day they'd realize what they were doing and try to fix it, but in that moment, I knew there would be no fixing. There was no apology big enough, no explanation that could erase 5 years of erasure. And yet, as angry as I was, there was still that sting of longing, that part of me that wanted so badly to mean something to them, to be enough to earn even half of the affection they showered so effortlessly on my sister. It's humiliating to admit, but that's the truth. They had carved me out of the picture, and I was still standing there on the edges, aching to be let back in. I poured myself another glass of wine, leaned back, and laughed, because what else can you do when life decides to turn into a cruel joke you didn't sign up for? The laughter came sharp, bitter, filling the empty living room with a sound that wasn't really laughter at all. And that's when my phone lit up, not with a call, not with a text saying happy birthday, but with a voicemail notification. Mom's voice, shaky and low, saying, "Call me. It's important." For a moment I just stared at the screen, my pulse loud in my ears. Important? After 5 years of nothing? After watching her buy my sister a car while I couldn't even get a phone call? I hit play again, listening to her voice, slower this time, almost desperate. "Please call me." And for the first time in years, I didn't know if I wanted to answer. I did not call back that night because there is a special kind of fury that arrives disguised as calm, the sort that makes you sit very still on the couch while your brain arranges old memories into a slideshow you never asked to watch. And as the hours stretched into the kind of quiet that feels like a test, I found myself replaying a long parade of moments that should have warned me this was not a sudden break, but a long, careful pruning where I was the branch that kept being cut away, like the year my school orchestra played in the city auditorium and Dad sent a text about traffic while Mom said she would catch the next one, although there was never a next one. Or the graduation where my name floated across the stage to the kind of applause that echoes in an empty hallway because the people you want to see in the seats decided brunch was more important. Or the Christmas when I brought homemade pie and was told gently to leave room for your sister's specialty, even though her specialty arrived frozen in a tin and left the oven smoking while everyone clapped anyway. When people tell stories about favoritism, they usually make one sister a villain and the other a saint, but real life is almost always trickier and more irritating. Because my sister Elise could be generous in the way that people are generous when the spotlight is already on them. And she would send selfies from the hair salon and ask if she should go darker or lighter while I was in a work parking lot eating lunch in my car because there were deadlines no one else wanted, and she would tilt her head and say I took everything too seriously when I asked why our parents never seemed to notice what I did unless it could be tidily posted with a ribbon caption, which meant the car in the driveway, the bow bigger than our old golden retriever. And the flood of comments filled with words like deserved, blessed, and proud were not only predictable but almost textbook in the way they refused to see the cost of making one child the headline and the other a footnote. I went to bed with my phone upside down on the nightstand and slept the way you sleep after a migraine, heavy and dreamless, and in the morning I made coffee, opened the curtains, and decided that if my mother wanted important, she could have it. Just not the kind she expected, because there is revenge that explodes and revenge that breathes, and I have learned that the second kind lasts longer and leaves fewer fingerprints, so I started with something small and satisfying and, frankly, overdue. I changed the settings on my social accounts so my parents and a neat collection of their closest cheerleaders were placed into a private, restricted list that let them stare at a gentle loop of benign photos while everyone else could see what I actually cared to share. Then I scrolled to Elise's car post and, with the steadiness of a surgeon, hit the heart icon and left a comment that read, "Beautiful car, may it carry you to the places where people show up for you the way you show up for them," which at first glance seems harmless and even supportive, but in a town where everyone knows everyone's business, it lands like a gentle bell that keeps ringing in the back of the room until people begin to turn their heads. By noon an aunt had liked my comment and added a line about how I always had a way with words, which made me smile in a way that did not reach my eyes, and a former neighbor messaged me privately to ask if I was okay, which I ignored. Not because I am unkind, but because I had no interest in providing translations to those who had watched this family theater for years without once stepping in to cut the strings, and as the day unspoled I performed a series of small, strategic edits to my life. That felt like dusting a shelf you never realized was grimy, canceling the monthly auto-ship of that gourmet coffee my parents liked and always assumed I would bring when I visited, removing myself from the group chat that buzzed most loudly when Elise needed applause, and setting a quiet reminder in my calendar for the first of each month to revisit any unpaid favors and send them back to their rightful owners with a polite bow. I did not ignore my mother's voicemail to be cruel, although I will admit there was a delicious kind of power in letting those words sit like a pebble in her shoe for a day, and then another. And I justified that choice with a simple test I would recommend to anyone who thinks silence is always unkind. If a person can ignore you for 5 birthdays in a row, they can survive 2 days without getting whatever it is they suddenly call important. So when she finally followed the voicemail with a text that used my full name and asked if we could talk today, please, I poured a second cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the sunlight crawling across the wood like a clock I could finally read, and I called her back with my voice set to the same steady register I use at work when I am asked to fix a problem I did not create. She answered on the first ring with a breathy gratitude that tried to wrap me in a hug I did not accept, then cleared her throat and asked how I was, which I answered truthfully, saying I was fine and busy and had seen Elise's post, and then there was a pause, the kind that swallows a room, before she rushed in with a jumble of words about timing and surprises and you know how your sister is, the kind of deflecting phrases that make grown women feel 12 again, and I let her talk until she ran out of air, at which point I said that I appreciated the call and that I would be keeping some distance for a while, because distance was the only gift that had ever been mine to give, and I intended to see what it could buy me. For my small act of revenge that day, I did something so tidy it felt like a signature. I created a repeating calendar invitation titled Your Daughter's Birthday, set it to all day, recurring every year without end. And I shared it with both of my parents at their personal emails, including a short note that read, placing this here so you do not forget again, since remembering appears to require a system, and as I hit send I felt a measured, almost professional satisfaction, the kind that comes from installing a reminder not out of hope but out of documentation, a timestamp that says the forgetting will never again be invisible. The invitation pinged their inboxes a second later. And, before I could decide whether to feel triumphant or tired, my phone buzzed with a new notification that was not from my mother and not from my sister, but from an unfamiliar number that displayed the town's area code and a single line of text that read, "Call me about your parents, it's urgent." Which, even for someone practiced at calm, landed with the heavy scrape of a chair pulled back before a conversation you cannot avoid. The day after I set my parents' birthday reminder, I felt a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the air around me, the kind of change that doesn't announce itself with fanfare but settles like dust on a surface you never realized was uneven. And I could not decide whether it was satisfaction or a prelude to something more complicated, because when you spend decades as the overlooked child you develop a sixth sense for the subtle movements of attention, the way glances flicker and voices change tone when someone senses that the rules they've always counted on have been rewritten without their consent, and it was in that small, almost microscopic space between one email alert and another that I realized I had finally drawn a line I would not allow them to cross again. By mid-morning, I was already drafting the careful boundaries I intended to enforce, the kind that are invisible to casual observers, but unmistakable in their effect. I responded to their texts with brevity that bordered on coldness. I curated my social media with deliberate omissions, highlighting moments in my life that were self-sufficient and complete, while omitting anything that would provide them an easy route back into the narrative of my successes or failures. And I watched quietly as they, unfamiliar with a child who refuses to perform for their approval, started to hesitate, stumble over casual remarks they might have thrown off with ease in the past, and I felt a satisfaction I could not explain, a mix of vindication and relief. Knowing that for the first time in years, I was no longer a passive participant in the theater of their favoritism, but an author of my own terms. The tension that had been quietly simmering for weeks came to a head when my father called, his voice clipped and formal, a sharp contrast to the warm, though distant, tone he had always used when speaking to my sister, and he asked me to co-sign on a lease for Elise, who had apparently decided to move into a larger apartment in the city, one with rent that hovered at a number I would have considered absurd, and when he finished the request, pausing for my immediate acquiescence, I heard the underlying assumption that I would, as I always had, comply without complaint, and I realized in that moment how deeply I had internalized the expectation of obedience for so many years, an expectation that now I could discard with no guilt. Only a sharp awareness of the power I had accumulated by choosing to stop being invisible. I told him I would not co-sign, that the lease and its obligations were for Elise to navigate, and I explained, with careful precision, that 5 birthdays forgotten, 5 years of invisible existence, And the countless small favors I had been assumed to provide without acknowledgement had taught me the value of maintaining my autonomy, a lesson I was no longer willing to compromise, and his voice rose. An almost unrecognizable combination of shock and frustration, because he had never encountered a refusal so resolute and yet devoid of anger, a refusal that bore the weight of carefully measured indignation rather than impulsive resentment, and I heard my mother's voice in the background, asking him to pause, to not escalate, to handle me with the gentleness she had never once extended when I needed it most, and I allowed the moment to stretch, knowing that the discomfort I caused was part of the corrective I had been building for years, a subtle reclamation of what had been systematically denied to me. Later that evening, Elise posted again, a photo of her new apartment's living room, the sunlight glinting off the polished wood floors, a throw pillow perfectly aligned with the edge of the couch, and a caption thanking Mom and Dad for helping her with the initial deposit, and I could see, in the comments, the chorus of admiration and support that had always been so generously dispensed to her while I had been left outside the circle. And I allowed myself a small, precise act of satisfaction, crafting a reply that acknowledged her achievement while subtly highlighting the independence I had claimed for myself, a reply that read, "Congratulations on your new space. May it be as steady and self-sustaining as the boundaries we all sometimes need to set." And I knew that anyone who read it closely would detect the undertone of reclamation, the assertion that I was no longer an ancillary character in her story, but a quiet presence with agency, and that in itself carried more weight than any acknowledgement they had ever offered me. That night, when I closed the laptop and poured myself a glass of wine, I felt the weight of both liberation and anticipation, the tension of having disrupted a system that had persisted for decades, and I realized that the moments I had previously spent waiting for recognition had been transformed into a deliberate strategy, a choreography of subtle acts, invisible yet impactful. And as I traced the rim of my glass with a finger and looked out the window at the city lights, glimmering with the quiet indifference of a world that never paused for anyone, I understood that the real reckoning was not yet here, that the final measure of power would come when the emotional debt I had cataloged for years was confronted directly. And in that anticipation, I felt both the thrill and the tremor of a long-delayed confrontation that promised to change the dynamics of our family forever, leaving me perched on the edge of control, observing the patterns of neglect with a clarity I had never before allowed myself to claim. The moment I realized that 5 birthdays of neglect were not anomalies but a carefully maintained pattern, I understood that any future interactions with my parents would require a new framework, a set of rules I would dictate, not the ones they had silently enforced for decades, and it was with this clarity that I approached the conversation about Elise's lease, which had already become a quiet battlefield, not because my sister needed me, but because my parents were accustomed to my compliance as a default setting, as if my existence was something to be managed rather than celebrated or respected, and in that realization, I found a strange sort of empowerment, a sense of authority that had been dormant for years while I played the obedient child and quietly absorbed the unequal distribution of affection and attention without protest. I spent the day meticulously planning my approach, considering every word, every intonation, aware that a single misstep could revert the power dynamic to the old hierarchy, and I took care to ensure that every decision I made, every refusal, every act of self-preservation carried the weight of accumulated history, a quiet ledger of years in which my contributions were taken for granted, my milestones ignored, and my presence rendered optional, because in family dynamics, the absence of recognition can be as violent as any explicit rejection, and I was finally refusing to accept that violence in silence. When my father called again, his voice carried a brittle edge, the sort of strain that comes from encountering resistance where compliance had been assumed, and I responded with deliberate calm, explaining that co-signing the lease would constitute a breach of the boundaries I had set for myself, that my autonomy was not negotiable, and that the years of invisibility I had endured were not erased by an act of sudden generosity toward another child, and as he stumbled over justifications that had been rehearsed for years in his mind, I listened, noting the shift in tone, the almost imperceptible falter in his confidence. And I allowed myself a small, private satisfaction in knowing that the equilibrium had been disturbed, that my refusal resonated louder than any protest I had issued in the past. By afternoon, Elise had posted yet another photograph, this time a panoramic view of the apartment's living space, sunlight reflecting off the newly polished surfaces, a throw blanket arranged with precise symmetry, and a caption thanking our parents for the deposit and their guidance, a public acknowledgement that struck me with the strange mixture of humor and indignation that comes when someone flaunts a privilege you have been denied. And I crafted my reply with careful deliberation, praising her accomplishments while subtly asserting my independence, a comment that read, "May your space be a reflection of the effort you have invested and the choices you make on your own, without relying on inherited assistance." A phrase that conveyed both admiration and the quiet sting of truth, and when I hit send, I felt the layered satisfaction of reclaiming agency in a system that had long rendered me secondary. A subtle victory that would resonate far beyond the confines of a digital screen. As evening approached, I prepared for what I knew was inevitable, a confrontation that would not be loud or dramatic, but would carry a weight built up over years, and when a soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts, I looked through the peephole to find my mother. Mascara-streaked, eyes glistening with tears, standing on the porch in a way that suggested desperation rather than apology, and in that instant, I recognized the culmination of my strategic patience, the point at which accumulated tension demanded acknowledgement, forcing her to step into the vulnerability that she had never extended toward me, and I remained behind the door, silent, letting the moment unfold according to its own rhythm. Aware that this was the intersection where years of oversight, neglect, and carefully measured retaliation would finally collide in a tangible, undeniable way. When she began speaking, her voice quivering and low, attempting to reconcile years of neglect with a plea for understanding, I could hear the strain in every word, the way she tried to navigate between explanation and justification, between her own regrets and the inevitability of her actions, and I allowed her to speak, not out of forgiveness, but to absorb the full measure of the emotional labor she had denied me for years, to witness the raw vulnerability that had been absent from every birthday, every milestone, every photograph she had chosen to circulate publicly while ignoring my presence entirely, and as her words tumbled out, I measured my own responses with a precision born from years of self-preservation, allowing a carefully modulated calm to convey the weight of my decisions and the inevitability of my boundaries without needing to articulate every detail of my accumulated resentment. Finally, when her voice faltered and she paused, searching for a lifeline in the silence I maintained, I felt the full impact of the power shift, the subtle, almost imperceptible victory of having established autonomy in a system that had long denied it. And I knew that the next moments, the choices that would follow, would define not only my relationship with my family, but the emotional architecture I had built for myself, a structure of careful boundaries, deliberate attention, and measured engagement. And as I stood behind the door, considering whether to open it or leave her waiting, I felt a clarity that had been elusive for decades, a sense that control, once assumed to be impossible, could finally be exercised without apology or compromise. When my mother finally stepped onto the porch, tears streaking down her face and mascara clinging stubbornly to her lashes, I could see the weight of years compressed into her posture, the slump of her shoulders betraying the gravity of the realization she had only just begun to confront, and I stood behind the door, aware that every choice I had made leading up to this moment, the calculated silence, the small acts of subtle revenge, the assertions of autonomy and independence, had brought us here, to a threshold where years of neglect collided with sudden vulnerability, leaving both of us suspended in a fragile, almost electric tension that made the air itself seem heavier. Charged with the unspoken truths that had been carefully buried beneath birthdays, social media posts, and the endless parade of favors that had always gone unnoticed. She began speaking before I could offer a word, her voice trembling but relentless, a river of pent-up regret and fear spilling over the dam she had held for decades, as she tried to explain the choices that had elevated Elise above me, insisting that they had never intended to hurt me, that the lavish attention and financial gifts had been meant to compensate for perceived needs, that my sister's successes required a hand she was unwilling to give to anyone else, and as she spoke, I measured every syllable, every breath, noting the contradictions between her words and the reality of the past 5 birthdays, the consistent absence of acknowledgement, and the deliberate acts that had left me feeling invisible. And I realized that what she offered now was not reconciliation but exposure, the raw confession of a system that had always been inequitable, presented to me as a plea for forgiveness that I was not prepared to grant. I listened quietly, allowing the confession to fill the space between us, weighing the sincerity against the backdrop of years of absence, and I could see the tremor in her hands. The way her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her coat as though trying to anchor herself in the only tangible thing she had, and I thought about the small victories I had accumulated in the past weeks, the refusal to co-sign, the social media boundaries, the careful reminders placed in their inboxes, and the way each act had shifted the balance of power so subtly that it now culminated in this fragile moment where she, not I, was forced to confront the consequences of neglect. I did not step forward immediately, did not allow my expression to soften or harden, but maintained the careful equilibrium I had cultivated. Recognizing that any move on my part would either erase the gravity of my position or invite a negotiation I was not willing to entertain, and I let her continue, spilling words about fear of losing the family she had chosen to favor, regret that she had ever permitted such disparity, and the realization that her intentions had consistently collided with the emotional needs of the child she had chosen to overlook, and in the silence that followed, I felt the culmination of years of deliberate preparation, the satisfaction of having established a presence that demanded acknowledgement rather than compliance, a presence that was finally impossible to ignore. She begged me to come inside, to sit, to allow her to explain in detail, to forgive, and to participate once again in the rhythms of a family that had long treated me as optional, and I looked at her, at the tear-streaked face that had been indifferent for years. And I considered the calculus of trust, the balance of past betrayals against present vulnerability, the consequences of opening a door that I had spent years learning to close decisively, and I realized that for the first time, I had the power to dictate the terms of my engagement with them, to determine whether reconciliation, at whatever cost, was worthwhile or whether leaving her on the porch, letting her experience the weight of absence as I had for half a decade, was the final assertion of autonomy that I had labored to achieve. Finally, I spoke, carefully, deliberately, the words chosen to convey both acknowledgement and refusal, saying that I had hurt her, that I understood the emotions behind the confession, but that the years of neglect and favoritism could not be erased by tears or explanations, that the balance had shifted irrevocably, and that I was choosing to preserve the boundaries I had fought to establish, to protect the agency I had reclaimed. And in that moment, I saw her body stiffen, the subtle surrender of someone realizing that apologies, no matter how heartfelt, could not retroactively change the past, and I closed the door slowly, deliberately, leaving her standing there in the early evening light, watching her retreat into the empty silence she had once imposed upon me, and I felt the strange mixture of relief and melancholy that comes with reclaiming control, knowing that I had finally ensured that my presence, my choices, and my boundaries would no longer be invisible to those who had long refused to see me. The door clicked shut, and in the echo of that sound, I allowed myself to acknowledge that some victories are quiet, almost imperceptible, and that the most powerful forms of revenge are not explosive or vengeful in the conventional sense, but deliberate, measured, and deeply final, leaving no room for misinterpretation, only for the enduring understanding that I had chosen myself above the demands and expectations of a family that had once made me feel dispensable, and that in that quiet, irrevocable decision, I had finally reclaimed what had always been mine, the right to be seen on my own terms, and the right to withhold my presence until and unless it was welcomed genuinely, without obligation, and without compromise.